Hi, this is Liz with the San Luis Library. I'm here to talk about the 1929 Women's Air Derby race in which 20 women competed for a $25,000 prize. The Wright brothers were the first to create sustained flight. The first flight was in 1903, but the first hour-long flight was in 1907. By 1914, planes were used for combat during World War I, and many of those combat pilots returned to the U.S. and set up flight schools and competed in national air races and shows. The men who competed could make a living from show to show, setting records and giving lectures. The period between the World Wars was considered the golden age of flight. Women took to the skies along with men. The first woman to pilot a plane was an Italian named Thérèse Peltier. The first female pilot to get her pilot license was Elise de Roche. Blanche Scott was a solo pilot and stunt flyer. Scott was the second woman to drive an automobile across the U.S. states along with a reporter in 1910. She retired from flying in 1916, citing the industry's refusal to allow women to become engineers and mechanics, and concern over the media's morbid interest in plane crashes. Bessie Coleman was the first African American and Native American who started flying and encouraging other African Americans to pursue their dreams. She had to learn French and moved to France to get her license since no school in the U.S. would accept her. She got her license in 1921 and returned to the U.S. Air shows became a national pastime during the 20s and 30s. Air races were used to publicize the aviation industry, and in the 1920s, private aviation engineers and planes were able to compete with military aircraft in the races and events. Stunt flying was already a known pastime, and the first cross-country race was in 1920. Women were not invited to participate. This race was originally called the Pulitzer Trophy Race, however it later became known as the Cleveland National Air Races, and in 1929, women were finally allowed to compete, but not alongside the men. To qualify for the race, all the women pilots had to be registered pilots. They had to have at least 100 hours of solo flight, including 25 hours of cross-country flying, and they had to be a certified air mechanic. The women fought against discriminatory rules every step of the way. The organizers initially wanted a shorter race because women couldn't fly over mountains, then insisted that each woman be accompanied by a male mechanic, which the woman said would undermine their own status as a pilot, even if they flew the entire way themselves. The course wasn't even finalized until the night before the races, and every time there was an accident, organizers wanted to shut the entire thing down. The pilots had to fight the organizers to keep going after tragedy struck. Another rule that the women had to follow was that they had to use a plane with an appropriate horsepower for the women. This meant that Opel Kuntz had to borrow a less powerful aircraft in order to participate. The transcontinental race consisted of 8 days of flying between Santa Monica, California to Cleveland, Ohio. Women also competed in 5 other shorter races such as the Pylon Speed Race. Navigation on the transcontinental race was done by dead reckoning, a method involving using maps and landforms as guides. Radios for navigation weren't used in planes yet, and dead reckoning meant that pilots could easily get lost by following the wrong road, train tracks, or landmarks. The race started in Santa Monica in the early afternoon. The pilots would fly to San Bernardino. For some of the pilots, the race was easier than others. At the starting line, Mary von Mock was forced down in Santa Monica when the planes crowded her out. She was only delayed a few minutes, though. Amelia Earhart was plagued by small issues such as a malfunctioning starter that delayed her on the first day. In landing the first day in San Bernardino, the sky was filled with dust as each plane landed before her. Both Amelia Earhart and Opel Kuntz had problems with visibility and landed hard, causing small damages to their plane. On the second day, in Yuma, she had to replace a part on her plane, and all the pilots agreed to delay leaving Yuma until the part arrived and Earhart was ready to fly. On the second day, the group left San Bernardino and headed to Yuma, then on to Phoenix. One pilot left Yuma but never made it to Phoenix. Marvel Crosland was an experienced pilot, the first woman in Alaska to get her license. She worked as a commercial pilot with her brother and set an altitude record on May 29, 1929. Her plane was found in mesquite trees in the Gila River Valley. Her body was thrown from the plane. In the 1960s, it was concluded that she died of carbon monoxide poisoning. The organizers tried to cancel the race after Marvel Crosland's death, but the rest of the pilots advocated strongly for the race to go on. The route along the southern border from Arizona to Texas would see many pilots losing their way and ending up in Mexico. Mary Hazelip and Pancho Barnes both made several detours across the border. Many of the pilots followed roads and landmarks to get where they're going. Unfortunately, Pancho Barnes ended up following railroad tracks that led her straight to Mexico. She landed in a field and several farmers greeted her in Spanish. She managed to get back on course. In addition to flying, the women were also responsible for attending banquets and festivities and to do meet and greets at every stop, which meant for the duration of the race they were sleep deprived. All the planes were scheduled to undergo maintenance and any repairs in Wichita, while the pilots attended events in their honor. The women pilots received more attention than the men in the newspapers, but the kind of attention they received wasn't the same. Only one pilot was quoted about flying. Most of the write-ups were focused on their fashion. Not all the pilots made it to Cleveland as part of the race. Pancho Barnes crashed at an airport while an eager spectator drove out onto the landing strip in Pecos, Texas. Her plane was totaled. She eventually made it to Cleveland, but she was out of the race. Margaret Perry was hospitalized with typhoid fever when she landed in Abilene, Texas. Bobby Trout landed in Mexico inside of Yuma after running out of fuel and crashed her plane. It was dragged across the border and rebuilt in Yuma. It took 3 days for her to continue on, but she wasn't timed because of the delay. The pilots left East St. Louis on a foggy Sunday morning. Louise Thaden arrived to find that her oil had been drained. No sabotage was ever proven, but several pilots insisted that they suffered sabotage. Oil and fuel issues, engine lines being cut, and other problems followed the pilots during the entire race. Ruth Elders found a cigarette butt in her plane, but she doesn't smoke. And Claire Fahey's plane suffered from mechanical damage or sabotage. Acid ate through some of the wires, disabling her plane. The final stretch of the race was Columbus to Cleveland in Ohio. Louise Thaden came in first, and as soon as she touched down, spectators swarmed her plane. She dedicated the trophy to Marvel Crossan. Gladys O'Donnell came in second. Ruth Nichols would have been third, but that morning she did a quick test flight and landed at a small unfinished airport in Columbus and crashed into a steamroller that was in the landing strip. She totaled her plane, leaving room for Amelia Earhart to come in third. After excluding women from air races for another 6 years, Louise Thaden and Blanche Noyes went on to win the very prestigious Bendix Trophy in 1936, the second year in which women were allowed to compete. Amelia Earhart took the Bendix race in 1935 and placed fifth. The 1929 race was one of many steps towards including women and seeing women as competent pilots. Women were still excluded from competing with men and often had fewer events, with less prize money making it harder for women to make a career out of the airshow circuit. Many companies refused to hire women as pilots, and for many women, being a pilot meant having family money they could spend. After the race in 1929, the 99s were formed. The 99s is an association of women pilots that is still active today. They promote women pilots and lobbied for their inclusion in the national air races and in other shows across the country. They were named for the number of original charter members in 1931. The 1929 National Air Derby marked a change in air shows, allowing experienced women to participate in the air derbies. And though they faced many challenges in being seen as capable and reliable pilots, this was an initial step to give women pilots jobs in transport and commercial businesses. However, aviation is still predominantly a men's professional field. According to the FAA, in 2020, only an estimated 8.4% of certified airmen pilots were women. These women were adventurers, trendsetters, and record setters. They continue to inspire young plane enthusiasts today. They lived very colorful lives, and you can learn more about them by checking out these resources from the library.